Welcome to the Around the Table podcast. This podcast is all about the ministry and preaching of Lebanon Baptist Church in Greensboro, North Carolina. Hosted by the pastors of Lebanon Baptist Church. The goal is to help you grow in your faith and spiritual walk with the Lord every single day of your life. To learn more about Lebanon Baptist Church, visit lbcnow.org. Thank you for joining us, and let's get started.
Welcome to the Around the Table podcast. We're joined today by Pastor Matt. I am Kyle. I'll be your host today. And we're going to follow up with Matt's sermon from this past week on 5 characteristics of good biblical masculinity that was modeled in Daniel 6. And we'll cover a few topics surrounding that. But first, I do feel like I need to justify myself a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to give you a chance to do that. So let me just, for those that might be watching or listening that were not in the service Sunday, Pastor David did a really great thing in having some of the kids.
Yeah, it was a wonderful video.
He had some of the kids say some things about their dads and put a nice little heartwarming video together for the fathers. Now, there was a question that came up, and your son, one of your sons, said when he was asked what was one word describe your dad, he said, scared. And then he added, of birds.
Right.
Well, and I'm like, all right, we got to give you a chance to redeem yourself, to explain yourself.
Yeah.
And you said, we were talking earlier, like, what a perfect little thing to be said about you as we're getting ready. We're going to talk about manhood.
Right.
We're talking about manhood today. Tell us about your fear of birds.
Exactly. And the sermon's on biblical manhood and masculinity, and my son says, I'm scared of birds.
His dad's scared of birds.
I am glad that at least he put in the of birds part.
Yeah, if he'd have just said scared. My biblical manhood would just be completely ruined. So I am glad that he put that caveat in there, at least. And so I'm not scared of all birds. There's only certain types of birds that I'm afraid of, and they're just little birds, the smallest birds you can think of. And I know that makes it even worse. That's weird.
In a way.
Small birds.
Ducks don't bother me. Chickens don't bother me.
A duck's a duck.
Yeah.
That's not a bird.
Even, bald eagles don't scare me. Like, big birds don't scare me. I mean, maybe big
bird.
Because that's just creepy.
Yeah, that's creepy.
Little birds, especially ones that get trapped in your house. And that's where this whole fear came from, was we've had a couple of birds invade our house, probably because of our kids leaving the doors open as they're going outside. But they're just crazy. Like, you can't catch them. You can't shoot them. You can't get them out of your house. And so that's where the fear came from.
Just be a man.
Be a man. Throw a sheet over them.
Be a man.
Get them out of your house.
And get that bird out of your house.
Yeah.
But this happened
and
recently.
That's what I did.
Like, you just had a recent problem. That's why it was on his mind.
No, I mean, it's probably been.
You said a great example. It's been a long time, and he still remembers.
Well,
what's one thing you learned from your father growing up? To be afraid of birds.
So I shared it with the kids ministry on a Wednesday night because we were talking about fear. And, I wanted to make it comfortable for the kids that they could be open and honest with their feelings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I shared that I was afraid of birds, and usually it gets a good laugh.
Yeah, that really hurt you.
It did.
Yeah.
It did.
Okay, so let me just say, as we were preparing for this episode, I thought, like, maybe we give your man card back after hearing the explanation. Now I'm not sure.
I was hoping to win it back.
Yeah, you were hoping. All right, you got some more work to do. So Kyle's got more work to do to redeem himself on that. But it's a good segue. Good segue.
Yeah,
talking about manhood.
And so hopefully I learned some things today about manhood and can apply them to my life so that I can win that man card back.
All right, I'll show some sympathy and support. I'm afraid of spiders.
There you go. And they're smaller than birds.
Spiders really terrify me. I think it was watching the arachnophobia as a kid growing up scared me to death. It's just, scary. I mean, like, when I go to squish a spider with some toilet paper, tissue paper, paper towels, sometimes I injure my fingers because I hit it so hard.
How do you get hurt?
And I will call my wife. That is one thing I'll call my wife to handle. Is like I'll take care of birds, snakes, you name it, frogs, spiders.
That scares me. All right.
That is one of the primary responsibilities of the husband in the home.
I think that's in the Bible.
Is to kill the spiders and bugs that are in your room. Mostly stink bugs around our parts.
But the Bible doesn't even address like birds. I mean, except being like not being afraid of them. Jesus even said, like, look at the birds, like your heavenly Father. If he cares for them, he'll take care of you, man.
Right. He'll protect me. From the birds.
Overcome your fear. And so we want to talk about
I did get the bird out, though. So that does give me, I did overcome my fear, got the bird out of our house. I did not make my wife do it.
Yeah, that's good.
Like you do with spiders. So, all right. Well, let's divulge, I guess, and get back into our biblical manhood here. So, like I mentioned, Matt went over 5 characteristics of good biblical masculinity modeled in Daniel 6. In a little bit, we'll get to some maybe not so good examples from the Bible of biblical manhood.
Yeah.
So the whole purpose, the whole premise, and we see it in our culture today, but that masculinity is toxic. To be a man is not something to be proud of today in our culture. And so while I think we do recognize that there is a form of masculinity that is certainly not a good thing.
Yeah, we'll talk about that.
But in general, being a man, and especially being a biblical man, is not a toxic trait.
Right. Yeah, I mean, when there's a bird in the house, when there's a spider on the floor, when there's a loud sound in the kitchen in the middle of the night, most women want their husbands to be a man.
Yeah, go take care of it.
Like, we don't want you to be a man any other time during your life, but when something happens late in the night and we're afraid, be a man.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, there is, and we'll talk about that. There is a form of masculinity that could be toxic, and I think can be described as such, and we'll deal with that. But the idea of masculinity in and of itself, we live in this culture today that's trying to blur all of the lines between male and female, and trying to just make those differences indistinguishable. Let's make everything a gender-neutral society, and in particular, men are under attack, and so I think I think that's something that needs to be dealt with and addressed. And look, what we dealt with Sunday in the message was just Daniel 6. Because we were in the book of Daniel, we're just looking at some good, positive, biblical traits of Daniel that set up for good characteristics of biblical manhood. Now, there's more characteristics of biblical manhood. I read an article a couple of days ago by Al Mohler, and it was 2 parts, but he gave like 13 traits of what it means for a boy to mature to becoming a man. What are some of those traits and markers of going from boy to man that dads, in particular fathers, ought to be teaching and looking at and trying to raise their children to measure up to certain marks for, okay, now you're ready to become a man and move from boyhood. And so there's a lot that could be dealt with, but we just dealt Sunday with some that emerged from the example of Daniel.
Yeah, and I think, pleasant attitude. I think a lot of times in culture today, when they talk about masculinity, they're not referencing a pleasant attitude or personal integrity. They're referencing violence and rage and things like that.
Violence, rage, anger, abuse of power, domination.
Right.
And those forms of masculinity would be like sinful forms where it's not brought under the subjection to the lordship of Christ and that sort of thing. And so we'll talk about that. Look, strength and power and assertiveness and confidence and boldness and courage are good masculine traits.
Yep.
They can get out of control, but again, those are good traits that we want to see. But we look at Daniel and see like a pleasant attitude in him, a winsome spirit or an excellent spirit as it's described. He's as you look at the chronology of his life and you think about Daniel 6, which is where he's thrown into the den of lions. He's about 85 years old at that point,
right.
And I just asked the question, like, how many 85-year-old men do we know that have a winsome spirit, that have a pleasant attitude, that are like fun to be around. I know some, but more than not, as we get old and we get, men get angrier and ornery and just, like nobody wants to be around them. And like I told my wife, I'm like, man, I have a fear of that for myself. Sure. Like I'm afraid I'm going to be like really hard to get along with when I'm old. And my wife's response was, what do you think you are now?
I know. I was going to say, I'm 42, and sometimes I feel like an old curmudgeon, just sitting around grumbling and stuff.
I know, man, back in my day, before we had iPhones and all, this kind of stuff. But, he had a good, excellent, winsome spirit, and I think having a pleasant attitude is something to be desired. It's a good model for manhood, and that was one trait we looked at, yeah.
Yep, it is. And you brought up the point, I think, that with the rage and the violence and things like that, when men sin, we do tend to sin bigger, and in a more destructive way, I think. That might be a generalization, but I do think it still holds true that we do sin bigger, it has bigger consequences that we see. But even with that, the answer is still not to go to the far end of the spectrum and, emasculate men or make it to where it should be gender neutral. Like it was designed to be two different roles, and men were designed to be different than women, and that's okay.
Yeah.
We don't have to emasculate and gender neutralize.
Yeah, right. And one's not more valuable than the other just because one has a different role to play. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we go through here. But there is a form of masculinity that is toxic where, power and strength are abused, right? And we could say that is toxic, but it's sin, like just pure and simple. When men who are stronger, by the way, I read an article, I'll throw this in there, but I read an article last week where a group was arguing that the reason that men in our society today are bigger and stronger and faster collectively, on average, than women is because of socialization. Social factors have contributed to men being, it's not biological. Yeah, no. It's like, no, like, this is just ludicrous, but yeah. No, it's because God designed us this way. He designed man and woman differently, and we should honor those differences and enjoy those differences. And look, see, when men, and this is a point that I'd written down, I wanted to talk about that you brought up. When men sin, they do tend to sin in bigger and more destructive ways, right? We have testosterone, we have increased power and strength. So when men sin, I would say that when men sin, when they let that strength and power get out of control, it does bring about more destruction. Yeah. I don't think that there's any denying that. The answer to it, though, is not, like you said, to emasculate them or to gender neutralize society. The answer is to teach men how to bring their strength under the lordship of Jesus Christ and to use their strength and power for the good of others. And see that, like, that's the whole point, is like, culture doesn't want men to exercise strength and power until they do. Right. Until they do want them to. Yeah. Until they do, And then it's like, but we've been told all along not to. It's like this whole bathroom stuff with and the transgender stuff with biological men wanting to go into changing rooms and locker rooms, at the YMCA or bathrooms where girls are because they identify as trans. Like, now we want men to stand up and say, no, we're not letting this kind of thing happen. We're going to protect our daughters. Right. But we've been telling them to sit by passively and be silent and don't exercise their strength. And now, and so it's like, this is where we've gotten in our culture. So, I think that's just something that needs to be shared and pointed out. But
yeah, absolutely. And I agree with that as well. I mean, it shows up in bigger ways, and in more destructive ways, like we've mentioned before. And so then the tendency then is just to go to the other far end of the extreme. So, but we did mention that.
Yeah. Let me point this out. Yeah. Like, why are more men are in prison. Okay. And one of the reasons for that is for violent crimes, because when men do commit crimes, they tend to be more violent in nature because of their strength and their power. I mean, that's just a cultural truth. But Yeah. We tend to err. Let's talk about that. Men tend to err. So again, what we want to strive for is redeeming masculinity and manhood. And we want to set a good example for that for our young boys and for young men growing up to become men. We want to set a good example of that. And we want to look at, okay, biblically, what does that look like? And there are a lot of examples in the scripture of men, and men tend to err to one extreme or the other. Right. And so let's talk about that a little bit, to dominate and control or to retreat and to become passive and silent. So we've got some examples to deal with. And by the way, this book, I think I've mentioned it before, but we were kind of reading through this together as a pastoral staff, written by Owen Strahan. It's called The War on Men, Why Society Hates Them and Why We Need Them. Just came out last year. And I think Owen is really doing a phenomenal job in this book in just presenting the biblical picture of masculinity as it ought to be, and kind of going through some of the cultural realities that we're dealing with. So anyway, I would recommend that.
Well, I would definitely recommend that to all men, especially, Christian men, to really understand, that we're not called in the Bible to be this archetype of strength and power and, things like that. And Owen does a really good job going through that. But I would also recommend it to moms, maybe even single moms of boys who just need a better understanding or are looking for a better understanding of how to raise a boy, in today's society. I think so many of our parents are taught now, like, don't buy your boy blue stuff, don't buy your daughter pink stuff. We don't want to, construct this idea of gender in them, but they're made that way.
Yeah,
not to wear blue. I'm not saying that.
No, but
they're made to play in dirt, and they're made to do, play that way. But we're, as a society, we're taking them away from the things that they're made to grow up as.
Yeah, the idea that gender is a social construct is just kind of crazy to me. And I would say all people are made to wear Carolina blue.
I would agree.
That's God's color.
Right.
Tar Heel blue.
And that's why we put them on boys.
Yeah, exactly. But, you're right. And that's a good point. I think, so, again, because of sin, like, we are sinful, broken, fallen, okay? And I would say that, look, we tend to err. All right, on the one extreme are men who want to dominate and control through their power and strength, and they abuse it.
Yep.
On the other end of the spectrum, you have sinful tendencies in men to retreat, become passive and silent, and to abdicate their leadership and really to shirk their responsibility. Right. And so what we want is, between those two extremes, we want to look at the biblical ideal. Now, let me give a couple examples, all right? Yeah. So like Adam in the Garden of Eden, I think Adam shows up as an example of a man who he was on the extreme actually of being silent and passive. When Satan, through the serpent, tempted Eve, what he did was he circumvented the created order. He went around him to the woman, and he conversed with her, challenging the authority of God, questioning the word of God, getting her to doubt the truth of God. He asks her a question. Has God not said you cannot eat of any tree? Well, God didn't say that. Then he says some things that are true, like God just knows if you do this, you'll be like him, knowing good from evil. Well, there's some truth in that, but there's a lie in that. And then in that, what happens is, the Bible actually tells us that Adam was with her.
Right. And I just turned there, verse 6, chapter 3. So when the woman... verse 6. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So you can't make the argument that he wasn't with her.
Right.
Or the argument that he's on the other side of the garden, because she gave him the fruit and he ate with her.
Yeah, growing up as a kid, I kind of was always like under the impression that, like, Adam was off doing something he was supposed to be doing. But in reality, the text of Scripture shows us he was right there.
He was right
so
there.
Here's the serpent tempting her. Here's her getting ready to break this command to go against God's created plan for them, to break his law and to eat this fruit. And he's standing there with her passively, silently, watching the whole time, when he had been put in the garden to subdue it, to keep it, to protect it. His responsibility here was to speak up, to intervene, to step in, to stop this from happening. And
the command was given to him specifically, not to eat, not to her, but to him.
Right. And nothing actually happens. Sin doesn't actually come in until he eats, which is an interesting thing to consider in and of itself. But, some have tried to make the argument, probably some man trying to abuse his power and dominate and control and use it wrongly. But some have tried to argue, I think wrongly, that, that Adam, loved her so much he didn't want to see her suffer. So he went ahead and he sacrificed and ate too and sinned too. I think that's kind of baloney, really. Yeah. But I think the idea is that he stepped away, or he was silent. She ate, gave to him, and he followed in that, rather than speaking up and leading. And so, again, that's, there are men like that where Larry Crabb wrote a great book back in 1985. It's like way back. He passed away 3 years ago, but he was a counselor and a biblical author. I would recommend a lot of his books, Larry Crabb. But he wrote one of his first books in the early 80s, mid-80s, was called The Silence of Adam. And he just deals with the theology from that, of how that has trickled into our society today, and how most men, we will retreat and be silent and passive unless we have to. It's just kind of part of our sinful nature now, is that we have that tendency.
Right.
And so I think, men need to come away from that extreme, and we need to step up to the plate, and we need to be present in the home, and we need to love our families and kids and lead them and speak up. I mean, I see fathers, who you look at, like you may look at their daughter, their teenage daughter, and you think, I know this dad is not, there's no way he's comfortable with the way his daughter is dressing and behaving, but he's not saying anything.
Right. He's just allowing her to just do it. He's taking a step back.
Yeah, he's taking a step back, and he's being passive, and you see that. And so I just think that's the one extreme.
Yep. And then you jump almost immediately in chapter 4 of Genesis to the other extreme, and one we've talked about a little bit, but with anger and kind of selfishness and self-pity in the example of Cain.
Yeah, so Adam's son Cain then shows us the extreme on the other end, the abuse of power. And what happens with Cain, he is in his anger and in his self-pity. God accepted the sacrifice of his brother Abel because he did it according to God's design. Cain did not bring his sacrifice, so he gets jealous, he gets angry, and he takes and uses his power in an abusive way and literally murders his brother.
Yep.
The word, by the way, when he set the whole thing up, it was premeditated. He invited his brother out into the field, and the word for slew him is actually the word of taking like a sharp rock and slitting the throat of an animal. I mean, there's a very violent kind of angry, self-loathing, defensive motivation, jealous motivation, and he uses his power, overpowers his brother, and slays him, kills him, murders him right out in the field.
Yep.
And see, that's the other end where we have then that tendency to overreact and to let our anger get the best of us. And we all know examples, and we can point to examples of men who do not control their strength. And there is abuse of power. There is abuse of women that takes place. There is abuse in the home of children that takes place. And sometimes that's, oftentimes there's physical abuse.
Right.
I mean, I could say that without any hesitation, growing up in my home, my father, for a time when I was young, he was the he was on that extreme. His anger would lead to the abuse of power, and there was verbal and there was physical abuse that took place, and you see there's devastating consequences of that. But again, that's sin, and that's wrong, and that's not true manhood.
Right.
That's a violation of it.
Yep. So. Yeah, absolutely. And then just to have one more example, I think probably an example in culture that we see today of what people would call kind of toxic masculinity, just in the sense of, using their strength and their brashness for their own gain, and that would be Samson.
Yeah, Samson. I mean, you can look at Samson, who shows up in Judges, and God uses him and accomplishes some things through him in spite of him. But Samson is kind of this guy who, in his strength and in his power, he basically sees something he wants and he gets it. Right. He's not supposed to do certain things, and because of his Nazirite vow, and he does it anyway. He's not supposed to get to touch a dead carcass, but he sees honey in the carcass of a dead lion. He takes it. He kills a bunch of Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. That's handling a carcass that he was not supposed to do. He sees a woman that he wants to have as a wife, and he tells his parents, "Get her for me." Later he meets Delilah. He wants her, so he says, "Well, I'm going to get involved with her." He is kind of the example of a bold, brash, flamboyant man who never really grows up. All of life is really for him about himself. Yeah. And, God redeems him and uses him in certain ways, but he has a very tragic life. In the end, his eyes are gouged out and he's made a servant and a slave of the Philistines. Think about that. A guy who got what he wanted when he saw it, has his eyes gouged out, by the enemy because, again, he was living for himself. And that was an abuse of power. And we see that today. We see guys all the time who live, they use their power as they're growing physically.
Right.
They're using their power to get things that they want for themselves. And that's not the biblical model for us. Right. I just was talking to someone the other day about a man in particular who came up positive on a paternity test that they were trying to identify and find out who the father for a child was, and anyway, it was kind of in the context of a fostering relationship, and basically what was said to me was that this man has about 17 children that have come up. That he's come up as the father of, and many different women involved in that, and that is a Samson kind of negative example,
right?
And I think when our culture sees things like that and sees things like the abuse of men and the abuse of their power and control, the tendency is we want to overcorrect to the other extreme.
Sure.
But I don't think the answer is in passivity and silence, because again, that's the opposite extreme. We don't want to go there.
Yep.
But yeah. Let me mention. I got one quote I wanted to share, kind of with our listeners and viewers. This comes from Owen Strahan in his book, and I've got a couple quotes I'll share here in the next couple minutes. But one of them, he wrote this. He said, "Our culture encourages boys to be passive and girls to be leaders. It strives to take the aggressiveness and assertiveness from our sons. We must not let it. While training our boys to be gentle and kind," which we absolutely need to do, okay? But while training our boys to be gentle and kind, we should always point them to the need for courage, for action, for decisiveness, and for clarity of leadership. Anything less is failure, a failure to obey God, and a failure to practice manhood as God formed it. This conviction is not merely something to teach, though. This conviction must be lived, modeled, and celebrated. And again, I just think that's something we have to work at today as men in particular, and even like you mentioned earlier, like a single mom who's trying to figure out how to help her boys. I mean, I would certainly encourage a single mom to get her boys around other godly men to help provide role models for them. But she can in that context, she can even teach and instruct, that they need to take courage. They need to be boys and men of action.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think going back to that quote just for a second, but I don't think Owen and I don't think we are saying that girls can't be leaders, that we shouldn't allow girls to be leaders or women to be leaders. But within a certain context, boys are designed to be leaders of the family, in a marriage, in church, as far as leaders as pastors and things like that. And when we don't raise our boys to be leaders, it creates a vacuum that ultimately is going to get filled. It's either going to get filled, as you mentioned, from the passive extreme or from the violent extreme, or the abuse of power extreme. And so we want to raise godly men to be leaders so that vacuum doesn't exist. I mean, it exists, but how much can we fill it up with godly men who can be leaders, raising our boys to be leaders in that way.
Yep. No, I agree. Yep. No, that's a good point.
And then just kind of continuing our theme, from looking at Genesis, it's really God's design of the male and the female roles. And in Genesis 1 and 2, in particular, there's 4 designs for men, for godly men, within those 2 chapters. So we'll go through these really quickly, but men are made to work. You mentioned it before, but when Adam was created and placed in the garden, he was instructed to cultivate it. He wasn't instructed just to sit back and watch the beauty of everything grow. He was instructed to work, not be made. He was not made idle and passive. And we've talked about that extreme of passiveness and idleness on the one end, but that's not how men were created, right?
No, you're right. Yeah, before we started recording, we were discussing that just a little bit, and I think Genesis 2, in particular, verse. I think it's verse 15 here. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to keep it. Work, I like to say it like this, work was around before sin. Men were created to work. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're not created to be idle.
Right. It wasn't the punishment for the sin. It was there before the sin.
Right. Yep. It was there before the sin. There was a consequence of the hardness of the labor and the sweating that would come about because of that. But work was around before the fall. We were not made to be idle and passive. But, you drive around in the middle of the day in some communities, and you see men idle and passive and standing around and not working and not busy. And when you see that, you see a neighborhood that is in turmoil, and you see a culture and a community that is that's struggling. When you see that, we were not made to be like that. We were made to work. That's one characteristic. A second one is men were made to protect. Yep. Not only were men made to work, but we were also made to protect, because He put them in the garden to work it and
keep it.
Keep it.
Yep.
There is a protecting, preserving influence, and I think the principle, translates that men are to be not only, providers and workers, but also protectors.
Yep.
And again, we understand that. We talked about it earlier. We understand that in the middle of the night when there's a noise in the kitchen.
Yeah. As long as it's not a bird.
Yeah. My wife would probably not be very happy if I said, honey, go check that out.
Right.
Go see what that noise was.
Yeah. I'll stay here.
Yeah. No, so we see that. Men are made to work. They're made to protect. Men are also made to lead. Yeah. I want to point this out. It's interesting in the Genesis account, the woman is not the one who is said to leave father and mother initially. Mm-hmm. It is the man who does that. The man leaves father and mother initially. He takes the risk. He steps out. He takes the initiative. Yep. The woman does not, in the text, hold fast to her husband. It's actually the man who is said to hold fast to his wife. And we see that in verse 24, man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. Right. And they shall be one flesh. So notice the responsibility there, the initiative, the risk-taking, and the responsibility placed on the man first. And I think there it is, the calling for men to lead begins there. He's the one responsible for pursuing the woman, doing the work necessary to keep the marriage. I want everybody to hear this. He is the one responsible for pursuing the woman and doing the work necessary to keep the marriage relationship strong. Holding fast is not a one-time event, but a lifelong endeavor placed on the shoulders of the man.
Yep.
I wanted to kind of point out about that idea. A lot of men may pursue a woman initially, and they get her to marry him, and they're like, man, I got this woman to marry me, and I can't believe it. She's so far out of my league, kind of thing. But he pursues and goes after, and they get married, and then he feels like, all right,
I've made it.
I've made it. I've accomplished it. I've accomplished my goal. And then what does he do? He doesn't hold fast to his wife. The holding fast to the wife is this idea that throughout the marriage relationship, he'll continue to work to keep the love alive, to keep the relationship strong, to keep their marriage intact. And I think I just want to encourage, and challenge men, to understand that responsibility.
Yeah.
And so men are made to work, to protect, to lead, and then the last thing, and we'll, as we kind of draw this to a close, men are also in the Scripture to love. And so I don't think that it would be good for us to not deal with that, to work, to protect, to lead, and to love. Ephesians 5:25. Why does the Ephesians text speak to husbands about one thing and to wives about another? Again, because we have different roles to play.
The creation,
we're
created order.
Yeah, we are equal in dignity and value to God. Men are not more valuable to God than women, or vice versa. We are equally valuable. We have equal dignity, but we are designed differently to function and to play different roles in God's plan. And so God says to men in Ephesians 5, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. And that is that men are called to a self-sacrificing, to setting aside selfish personal things for the good of their wife and for the good of their family. And so I think when men do this, a society flourishes. When men work, protect, lead, and love all together, society flourishes. And again, we are then living out good biblical manhood. So,
and too many times, just quickly, but within these four designs that we see here in Genesis 1 and 2, I think too many times men place an emphasis on one over the other. The stories of the men who work. Obviously we're made to work, but they put so much focus on the work that then they don't lead or love.
They neglect the family, and there's an abandonment sometimes that happens in that case where the man falls in love with his work more than with his wife, and that's an error that needs to be corrected.
Right. It's all four in combination is the design of God.
That's it. Because you've got some men who do not work, and they are idle, and they are passive, and they are not responsible at all, and that is a major issue. And then on the other extreme, you have some who go too far with it, and that's equally an issue. And so I think, I don't think one of those sins is more noble than the other. Both are devastating and bring about devastating consequences. One last quote from Owen Strahan I think is helpful for us in this cultural moment. He wrote, feminism and transgenderism should not lead men to think that misogyny and dominating women is the way forward. Sometimes I think when we see that stuff happening, we have a tendency, men have a tendency to gravitate towards the strong extreme. You got to be careful about that too. He said that's not the way forward. Men really are under fire today, but we should not exaggerate our manhood in response. Instead, we should embrace maturity, love wisdom, live confidently in God, enjoy being a man, and die to self in the power of Christ. So, men listening to this, and those that are especially married and have families, and those that strive to that, your calling is to work, to protect, to lead, and to love. And we want to call you towards that for the glory of God and for the good of others.
Yep, that we do. All right, well, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you for joining us on the Around the Table podcast. Thank you, Pastor Matt, for leading us in this discussion and your series on Daniel that'll continue in the coming Sundays. We do hope you'll join us on Sunday morning at 9:30 or 11 o'clock if you don't have a church home, and we will see you next time.